these tragedies and how quickly. There will be foreign policy reviews, particularly with regard to the Middle East, in the likely event that that's the source of the terrorism. And there will certainly be a review of the priority of the threats that we confront as a nation. So I see this event as having very profound consequences in this country for years and years to come. And on policy, those changes will begin very soon.
I know that you have been one of those many people in Washington who have been concerned about the possibility of a terrorist attack, and we have been saying this throughout the day, but I think it does bear worth repeating. No contingency plan that I ever saw, or even heard about for that matter, prepared this country for an attack of this nature, so complex, so sophisticated, and carried out with such cold-blooded efficiency. That's
true, but also predictable. I think most every expert that I know on terrorism has said, as indeed some of the reports have said, that the American people are not as secure as they think they are in their homes and in their workplaces, that eventually the terrorists, because of their increased skills, increased sophistication, and because of the vulnerabilities of our communities and of this country, because of its openness, that eventually they would make their mark, and they have. Now, I don't think any of us predicted this particular kind of an attack, but the fact that you had a massive terrorist attack on American installations and cities should not come as a surprise.
Unfortunately, I think that that's a commentary that rings all too true. Former Congressman Lee Hamilton, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It is a new day in America, a day of grieving and shock and anger, and a day of profound changes that are yet to come. In what form we cannot say for sure, but obviously this is not just an isolated incident in our lives. This is one that will be a marker in our history. And watching all of this from abroad is Alex Standish, who is with the Jane's Intelligence Digest, is one of the most highly regarded publications in the world in keeping track of just this kind of an incident. Mr. Standish, where were you and what did you think when you first heard that such a carefully coordinated and, I dare say, cold-blooded, efficient attack had been conducted against the United States?
Well, obviously, like all right-minded people, I was totally horrified, but I'm afraid I have to say not entirely surprised. As recently as Friday of last week, our publication specifically warned that anger in the Middle East directed towards the United States from the Islamic world was reaching crisis proportions. And we also specifically warned that there was an upsurge in terrorist activity in Lebanon, Afghanistan, and various other countries in the region, which were obviously being attended to by US intelligence. And so I think, as I say, we're horrified, but not surprised.
Why the United States has been trying to stay out of the Middle East. They've issued a couple of strong statements against rising Israeli violence, but it has not jumped in on the side of the Israelis, so to speak, in terms of this latest episode of exchanges between the PLO and Israel. Why do you think it came now?
Well, I think this has clearly been an operation which has been planned meticulously, possibly over months, even years. This is not something which has been put together overnight or even in the last couple of weeks. I think these individuals responsible for carrying out these appalling attacks are clearly people who have been in the United States for some time, or have been aided and abetted by those who have been in the country. They may well be what we would regard as sleeper agents. I think the timing is probably designed, as far as possible, at a time of renewed tension in the Middle East, to create really the conditions for derailing, possibly permanently, the peace process. But I think there is also an element in which recent pronouncements by President Bush, particularly his statement on the 24th of August, during which he called upon the Palestinians specifically to desist from terrorist activity, have certainly, I think, given the impression, even if that is not the case, that the United States was firmly in the pro-Israeli camp, as opposed to being an equal and honest broker within the peace process.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Standage, for being with us. We're going to go to Washington now. Our Washington Bureau Chief, NBC's Tim Russert. Tim?
Tom, it's extraordinary the mood in Washington. As you know, the president is now out in Omaha, Strategic Command. People in Washington very much looking forward to hearing more from him. The fact that he has chosen to go there, a place which is the nerve center of all our military activity, is an indication that perhaps this threat has not ended. There was some thought that he may be coming back to Washington, and the fact that he has not underscores the concern that there still may be a continuing threat.
We've just been hearing from some of our people in the Middle East and other places saying it would be inappropriate to link this to the recent administration policies in the Middle East, Tim, because, after all, as Mr. Standage just pointed out, this took a long time to plan this. This didn't happen in the last 6 weeks or so.
No, Tom, but there has been a steady stream of reports, very unsettling, from the Middle East. The head of Saudi Arabia intelligence resigned without much explanation. There's reports of a near insurrection in Georgia. Egypt has been experiencing a lot of street activity. Clearly, tensions and anxieties and incitements have become almost the norm, not only on the West Bank, but throughout the Middle East. So clearly, people here in Washington believe there is a tie and are targeting the notion that this is a direct response to the tensions in the Middle East, or at least that ongoing conflict. The other thing I can report, Tom, is that investigators are looking very, very closely. I reported earlier to you that, one, all the flights were bound to California with a heavy fuel load. They also now note that all 4 flights were Boeing 757s and 767s. I am told that these have exactly the same flight deck, that if you can fly a 757, you can fly a 767. And they note that rather than go for an Airbus or a 737, all 4 hijackings exactly the same kind of aircraft, which leads them to believe that the terrorists were, in fact, could very well have been pilots themselves who have been in this country for some time or trained to fly those planes after hijacking them, because they underscore how difficult it is to control a plane of that size directly into a target like the World Trade Center or the Pentagon.
All right, Tim Russert, as we continue to look at pictures at the hospitals here in New York City as they offload the various injured people, many of them suffering from smoke inhalation. A lot of them were not in the World Trade Center itself. They could have been in the perimeter of it. When it came down, there was an almost impenetrable wall of dust and smoke at that time. St. Vincent's and New York Hospital are both down in that area. New York has, as you might expect, both just across the line in New Jersey and in the other boroughs and in the city itself, a number of first-rate hospitals. CNBC's Ron Insana was down there, and he was caught in the midst of all of this as well. Now, when you look at that damage, Ron, you realize again how fortunate you were.
Absolutely, Tom. With the debris raining down, it was certainly a harrowing moment for many people in the lower reaches of Manhattan. And it, you know, as Tim Russert was suggesting, this attack clearly was designed to have maximum impact, not just in terms of the toll on human life or the political impact, but the economic impact as well. The World Trade Center is home to several Wall Street brokerage houses, to a few exchanges where gold and silver and things like that are traded. It is, in some ways, the financial nerve center of New York City. And we have to remember that at least 1/3 of all financial transactions in this country are routed through New York City, so it is very difficult at this time to assess what the economic damage is going to be to the country and to the systems that keep it running. Now, Federal Reserve officials and Securities and Exchange Commission officials say that they are in constant contact now to discuss their response to this, and one would assume also that the Federal Reserve, if required, would add what they call liquidity or money to the financial system in order to maintain something of an orderly economic environment. This comes at a time, of course, when the U.S. economy has slowed, where stock prices have come down in historic fashion, Tom, over the last 15 months. This is the type of event that will have rather severe economic consequences on top of everything we already know.
All right, thanks very much, CNBC's Ron Insana. I'm just reading one of the wire reports from the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. One of the passengers on board, we had heard this earlier, managed to get off a cell phone call to an emergency dispatcher saying that we're being hijacked, we're being hijacked. The plane went down about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. There's been some speculation that it might have been directed at another target of some kind as well, the Capitol or Camp David. We don't know, but it went down at that point. The man was in the bathroom. He had locked himself in the bathroom apparently at that time to say that they were being hijacked. There was an explosion, there was some smoke, and the plane went into a grassy field. All on board that United flight were killed, as you can see, just outside of Pittsburgh in Somerset County. It was that bizarre morning in which there were planes in the air, and some of the airlines didn't know what had happened to them. United, for a time, didn't know what had happened to that flight. In fact, we did know pretty quickly that the American airline flight 11 that went into the Twin Trade Towers first had started in Boston and then gone in there, and as we've been saying throughout the day, these were transcontinental flights and they had a heavy load of fuel, and they might have been picked for just that reason. And Tim Russert was pointing out that if you can fly a 757 or a 767, the flight decks are so similar, so these were probably trained pilots, because it's hard to imagine an American commercial airline pilot, even with a gun to his or her head, that would dive a plane into the Pentagon or into the Trade Center. And of course, what makes this kind of terrorism all the more difficult to deal with is that there are so many people who are willing to die for their cause, as they were in this case. The hijackers went down with the plane, with the planes here in New York and also in Pennsylvania and again in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon, where it could have been so much worse. It also tells you about the liberties that we have in this country, that 4 airlines were hijacked today. They flew over the nation's capital. One report indicating that it banked right over the top of the White House before heading for the Pentagon. It was a flight that had taken off from Dulles Air Force Base. And then the flights here in New York, wrapping around the twin towers of the World Trade Center and crashing into them. So you may think that you're inconvenienced by airport security, or that you have been in the past. Think about what it's going to be like in the future and how reassuring it will be to you if it gets tightened up considerably, because it will have to be. Those are just one of the many changes that will occur. James Baker is former Secretary of State, former Secretary of the Treasury. He joins us now. He's on the telephone for us. Mr. Baker, this is a stunning and dark day for America.
It is indeed a stunning and dark day. It is a very tragic and sorrowful day, Tom, and I can't imagine acts that are more dastardly or cowardly than what has been done.
There has been a fair amount of discussion today about the United States' role in the Middle East, about how we are inseparable in the minds of the Palestinians and other Arab states with the Israelis. You spend a lot of time in that part of the world. Has it gotten worse, do you think, in the last 2 months?
Oh, I think that the circumstances on the ground in the Middle East have gotten significantly worse in the last 2 months. But then that's really pretty much, Tom, an axiom of Middle East policy, that when there's no progress at the diplomatic table, if there's no political progress, then there's going to be increased violence on the ground. But I must say to you, as bad as it is, I'm not at all sure that we should jump too fast to relate this to the absence of progress in the Middle East peace process over the course of the past 2 or 3 months, because we've had these types of we've had attempts in the past which have been rolled up that had nothing at all to do with the Middle East peace process. And
we continue to be the favorite target of especially Islamic extremists around the world, and whether or not it's related to the Middle East peace process.
That's correct. That's the point I'm making.
Where do we go from here? If you were sitting at the national security table tonight with the President of the United States, what would you be recommending? And I don't want to put you on the spot to try to make it more difficult than it already is for your friend, the President of the United States, but conceptually speaking.
There are not a lot of easy answers. The President, I think, did the right thing when he said America is under a terrorist attack, and we are going to hunt down and punish those we find responsible. And I think that's the approach that the American people want him to take. I do not happen personally to believe we're going to find that a nation was responsible for this. I think we're going to find that it was a terrorist cell or a terrorist group. I think some other things that we need to seriously consider, we actually considered them way back there in my day, is beefing up our human intelligence capabilities. We've let those disintegrate badly over the past 25 years because somehow we held the view in this country that we didn't engage in the dirty business of human intelligence, and it is a dirty business. But if we're going to preempt these types of attacks, we have to have better human intelligence capabilities.
But also dealing with some of those states that are not necessarily sympathetic to our points of view is going to be a very tricky piece of diplomacy in the coming months.
There's a lot of there may be equal parts here of force and strength and resolve on the one hand, and diplomacy and politics on the other. It is very important that we do whatever we can to advance peace in the Middle East. There's no doubt about that, and that of course helps the moderate Arab states that are friends of the United States that have a very difficult time. The leadership of those states have a very difficult time when events like this happen, because when these types of events happen, they harden the views of the rejectionists on all sides.
Mr. Baker, I'm going to presume on our long-time professional relationship and ask you to stay on the phone for a few moments, because we're about to go to the Pentagon, where we're going to get a briefing on what has been going on there. You are a veteran of so many of the American episodes in the Middle East, including, of course, the Persian Gulf War. It's worth pointing out that this briefing is going on outside the Pentagon building. So if I could just ask you to stay on the phone, let's listen to Admiral Quigley.
Okay.
Oh, I'm told it's not quite ready yet. Well, I just will point out that the Pentagon was evacuated earlier today after what Jim Miklashevsky had first reported was an explosion. Then we later learned that it was a United Airlines airliner that crashed into the building near the helipad and penetrated 2 of the 5 rings. There were an untold number of casualties there. We were told earlier by military officials that some people were killed and a number of them had been injured. This obviously is the locus of a lot of the decisions that are being made today. American military forces around the world were put on extra alert. Aircraft carriers were dispatched from the waters off Virginia north to New York City after the second plane went into the Twin Trade Towers. Don Rumsfeld came out of his office for a time and now is working in a more secure location. The President of the United States, who's the Commander-in-Chief, has been moved to Omaha, Nebraska, to Strategic Air Command headquarters, where they have the world's best communication equipment and hardened bunkers that go down several stories, and he can be in touch with parts of his government that are now in different places in Washington, D.C. and the surrounding environs. Secretary of State Colin Powell is en route back from Peru. That's the gaping hole in the Pentagon. That is a stunning sight when you look at it. That building could not be more secure if you're trying to make a personal entrance into it, and it is fortress-like if you have ever driven by it. And yet when you direct an airliner into it, that's the kind of damage that can be done. Close to 100 people who were on board that plane were killed as well, obviously. Mr. Baker, let's talk a little bit about where we go from here in this country internally, how the President talks to America and how the political leadership, Republican and Democrat, begin to deal with each other after this attack.
Well, I think anytime you have a crisis such as this, it brings all Americans together, and it tends to bring all Americans together in support of their president, regardless of their party or their political affiliation. It happens in wartime, and it happens, I'm quite confident, in circumstances like this. So I think all Americans will be very supportive of the president and supportive of the administration as we work through these tragic events over the next few weeks. Let me just add, just as a matter of possible interest to you, it was a shocking experience for me today because I happened to be in my in my office in Washington, and I was listening to the reports of the planes going into the World Trade Center. And when that second one went in, or when actually I guess when the first one went in, it was pretty almost certain that it was a terrorist attack. And then I'm looking out my window, and it looks right out across the river, and I see this plume of smoke begin to rise from just about where the Pentagon is, and it's right. I'm looking out there at the very time that airplane goes into the Pentagon, and it was a shock, a real shock to see that.
even after all you've been through and all that I've been through, certainly, there was a sense of disbelief at the beginning, wasn't there?
Absolutely, absolute disbelief. And if you remember, some of the early comments were to the effect that maybe some of the aircraft directional devices got off course or something, and yet here were planes in broad daylight in perfect weather flying right into the middle of those Twin Towers.
All right.
It was terrible.
Mr. Baker, we're going to ask you again to stand by. We're going to go to Karen Hughes now, who is speaking for the President.
The activities of the federal government in response to this morning's attacks on our country. As you heard from President Bush a short time ago, the federal government is acting to help local communities with search and rescue and emergency management operations, to take all appropriate precautions to protect our citizens, and to identify those responsible for these despicable attacks on the American people. While some federal buildings have been evacuated for security reasons and to protect our workers, your federal government continues to function effectively. We have a federal emergency response plan, and at President Bush's direction, we are implementing it. We began to implement it immediately after the first attack in New York this morning. We contacted American forces and embassies throughout the world and placed them on high alert. The United States Secret Service immediately secured the President, the Vice President, and the Speaker of the House, and they are all safe. They have also secured members of the National Security Team, the President's Cabinet, and senior staff. As you know, President Bush was in Sarasota, Florida when the first attack occurred this morning. Air Force One has now landed at Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, and the President is in a secure location. He is in continuous communication with the Vice President and key members of his cabinet and national security team. Vice President Cheney and our National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, are in a secure facility at the White House. I have just come from there. The Secretary of Transportation and other members of our White House senior staff are gathered at a command center there, and we are coordinating with other branches of our federal government. The Secretary of Defense remains at the Pentagon, and the Secretary of State is en route back to Washington from his trip to South America. President Bush is conducting a meeting of the National Security Council as we speak. They are meeting President Bush from his location and other members from different locations in Washington and other locations. As many of you have been reporting, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered all airports closed, and all planes which were in the air were directed to land at the nearest airport. International flights were diverted to alternate locations outside of the United States. Transportation Secretary Mineta has directed the Federal Aviation Administration to suspend operations until at least noon tomorrow. So no airline flights will operate until at least then and until the FAA announces that operations will be resumed. Secretary Mineta has also issued orders controlling the movement of all vessels in United States navigable waters. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has activated 8 urban search and rescue task forces in New York, and 4 of these highly trained teams are at work here in Washington at the Pentagon. Every federal agency has implemented continuity of operations plans to make sure the government continues to function effectively. While the markets closed today because of the situation in Manhattan, the United States financial system has continued to operate. Banks have been open all day. The Federal Reserve has operated regularly and continuously. The Department of Health and Human Services has mobilized medical personnel and supplies to provide help to local authorities who are working so diligently to respond and try to help the victims of these terrible attacks. President Bush has committed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to identify and bring to swift justice those responsible for these despicable attacks. The Department of Justice is setting up a hotline for families who fear that their relatives may have been victims of one of these attacks, and we will be announcing that telephone number shortly. Our fellow citizens and our freedom came under attack today, and no one should doubt America's resolve. President Bush and all our country's leaders thank the many Americans who are helping with rescue and relief efforts. We ask our fellow Americans for your prayers for the victims, for their families, for the rescue workers, and for our country. Thank you all very much, and we will continue to update you as information is available and confirmed.
When will the president return to the White House? Will he go back to Washington?
One of his most trusted aides, and she's speaking on his behalf, giving us an overview of what the situation is today. He's talking about how the president ordered assistance, federal assistance for the local communities that were involved, including New York City, of course, and she said no one should doubt our national resolve in finding these people and punishing them who harmed American citizens on this day. There were a couple of additional pieces of information. Even vessels that are on navigable waters are now being controlled by the U.S. Department of Transportation. All flights will be grounded until noon tomorrow. We had already heard that. Banks did remain open, so financial services were going on today, and every federal agency had a contingency of operation plan that has been put into effect. We still have on the phone now for us one of the senior advisors in several administrations, former Secretary of State and former Secretary of the Treasury, James Baker. Mr. Baker, there's not a lot more that can be done at this hour, is there?
No, I don't think there's a lot more that can be done. I think the administration is doing what they can do and what they should do. And there's not really a lot more that can be done at this very moment, Tom.
At some point in the next 24 to 48 hours, though, the president is going to have to address the nation. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I think so. I don't doubt for 1 minute, but that he will. Now, he's already made two statements, I think, since these events occurred. And I rather suspect that when we get to an appropriate distance from the happening of the events, he will probably choose to address the nation.
Well, we're all most concerned right now, obviously, about those people who have been severely injured, those people who have been killed, those people who are still missing, and I want to emphasize that as our primary concern. But just looking ahead a little bit, there are going to be also economic consequences for this country just at a time when this economy is in a troubled state.
I'm not, if you're asking me that, Tom, I'm not too worried about that, frankly. I think, you know, we have a lot of systems in place that we have never had in place before as our economy weakens. Yes, we're in a weakening period here for the economy. And yes, events like this cannot be good for that. But I really am not too concerned about that. I think that you may see some negative consequences initially, but over the long haul, I think things are going to be fine.
Mr. Baker, we appreciate it very much, and we'll just ask you if we can once again to presume on our long-standing professional relationship and kind of keep you on call throughout the day, because this is going to be a long day indeed.
Well, I enjoyed talking to you, Tom, but I'm going to have to, at some point, I'm going to have to find a place to sleep tonight since I can't get back to Texas.
Well, we'll make sure that it's not too late, but we intend to be on the air here for a long time. At any rate, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. James Baker, former Secretary of the Treasury, former Secretary of State. He was, of course, President Bush the 41st, as we called him, his point man in the Persian Gulf War, tried to head off that war by meeting in Geneva with Tariq Aziz. That was unsuccessful. The war did go forward. He's a man who spends a good deal of his professional time now worrying and working on these matters that brought us to this sad state of affair that we find ourselves in America today. So we're coming up on 4 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern Time, one of the longest days in America, at 8:45 on a sparkling September morning here in New York City and in the nation's capital. There were two wholly unexpected and devastating attacks on the Pentagon and on the Twin Trade Towers. And then another plane went down outside of Pennsylvania, and we are still dealing not only with the physical effect of those attacks, all the injuries, the deaths, and the damage that has been done, but we're just beginning to have a full appreciation as well of the political and the psychological damage that may have been done to this country. Ron and Sana, James Baker, as I was not surprised, said, I think we'll be okay, but there's been so much talk in the American economy about the confidence of the American consumer and how we need to kickstart the confidence of the American consumer. That is going to be a concern.
Absolutely, Tom. And the one thing that the Federal Reserve, in its effort to manage this rather noticeable slowdown in the U.S. economy, the one thing the Federal Reserve was counting on was maintaining consumer and investor confidence. It was apparently easier to maintain consumer confidence with lower interest rates than investor confidence, but the consumer has been relatively strong despite the weakness we've seen in the economy. Housing sales had been near record levels, auto sales near record levels, and so by lowering interest rates, the Fed was keeping those things affordable and keeping the economy afloat. I had occasion to talk to someone who asked to remain unnamed, but who is familiar with how the government works during periods of crisis when it comes to economic matters, and obviously says that the New York Federal Reserve needs to, and some of this is rather technical, check how all the financial parties who have obligations to one another in Lower Manhattan are doing right now. It's a so-called settlement process. Who can make good on what trade or investment to whom? The New York Federal Reserve, as we stated earlier, has promised to provide enough money to keep the economy afloat through this difficult period, given that the center of the financial world has been attacked today. There is a process that will go forward. What is impaired physically in terms of trading systems, exchanges that are housed in the World Trade Center? What isn't? How are the books in shape? These are the issues that economic policymakers, Tom, have to deal with in the next 24 hours. There has been a great deal of speculation that the New York Stock Exchange will not open for business tomorrow. We don't know that to be true. Some worry that you don't disrupt financial markets regardless of what's going on in the world, because the disruption, even if for another day, can have a bigger psychological effect on the markets than if the market were to open and absorb the reaction to this calamity today, Tom.
All right, thank you very much. CNBC's Ron Insana, who was on a different kind of an assignment today when he was caught when that first building went down there, and we're grateful, obviously, that he was able to get out of there after a pretty terrifying time for him and for so many other people as well. We're now in that difficult period of trying to determine just how many people still are trapped in the World Trade Center area, people who were outside the building as well as within those towers when they came down. The rescue efforts have been proceeding cautiously because so many buildings down there are unstable. There was a lot of collateral damage when the buildings came down by the force of the winds and the force of the shock of the explosion of the buildings coming down. Just take a look at this, if you will. That's 110 stories of steel, concrete, glass, and electrical circuits collapsing to the ground in what amounted to be a heartbeat. And then all of that smoke and all of that dust and all of that debris began to explode out from the base of the building through the canyons of Lower Manhattan. And no one expected it would happen as swiftly as it did, obviously. And that's what they're trying to deal with down there, and there still is an enormous amount of debris in the air and certainly on the ground. The financial institutions that are located there have established 1-800 numbers, and they're calling their workers. This is the plane, the second plane that went in. Still is hard to imagine, isn't it? And obviously there was somebody at the controls who knew exactly what he wanted to do in this case, which was to drive that plane into the second of the twin trade towers. We were all still dealing with the stunning effect of the first attack when that happened. And then 18 minutes later, the second plane goes in. And when that was reported, I thought it was a wild rumor. And then at 9:30, Jim Eklashevsky said there's been some kind of an explosion at the Pentagon. In fact, it was a plane that crashed into that. Later, we heard that a United Airlines plane had crashed outside of Pittsburgh. It was en route from Boston from Newark to Los Angeles. It was United Flight 93 going from Newark to Los Angeles. It went down after a passenger on board using his cell phone radioed frantically, "We're being hijacked, we're being hijacked." Virginia Cha, you're in Midtown?
see the skyline of Lower Manhattan behind me, the familiar twin towers of the World Trade Center gone, obliterated, and we're not used to seeing that. And the smoke you referred to, the billowing cloud of gray smoke, continuously spreading up into the air for about the last 6 hours. That smoke filled with soot and ash, and most of the folks who are down there working rescue and either wearing gas masks or masks like these just in order to breathe as they work down there. It is the most horrible devastation I've ever personally witnessed firsthand. I was on foot this morning heading down to the World Trade Center area to meet a crew to cover this story when it first broke. On foot because all transportation shut down, police barricades, no way to get in by car. And as I walked down toward that area, thousands of people were streaming toward me, going away from that area, trying to escape the devastation and the potential danger. As I walked toward it, we all heard a rumble. There had been one tower still standing at that point, and we turned and gasped in just a horrific sight, as you've seen many times throughout the day. You've been watching that tower just cascading down. People watching from about 20 blocks north in relative safety saying, oh my God, tears, screaming. Unbelievable that there would be people in that building and near the building whose fate it was almost inevitable that they were going to be severely injured or killed. As far as the casualties, the numbers are trickling in, but of course very difficult because the rescue effort has been hampered because of the potential for danger. When we were down there, police continued to move us north, so we would be in one area considered safe, and then moments later they would come and move us a couple of blocks north more, saying that there was potential for more explosion. This was after both towers had already fallen. So it's difficult for them to get in. There have been hundreds of people taken to area hospitals, critically injured, as well as people who have not made it. And as far as people that may be still trapped or dead in the rubble, that information is still coming to us very slowly, Tom.
Thank you, Virginia. We have on the phone now the Jordanian ambassador to the United States, Marwan Marasher, and Jordan, of course, is one of the moderate Arab states. It's always had open lines of communication to this country. It has a new monarch since the death of King Hussein, and we're joined on the telephone now by Marwan Marasher. There are going to be a lot of Americans, obviously, Mr. Ambassador, who are upset by those scenes of some Palestinians on the West Bank who have been celebrating this day. What has been the official reaction of your government?
First of all, I'd like to express our condolences to the victims of the families and our strong condemnation for the act. His Majesty King Abdullah just sent a message of condolences to the President, and the government has issued its strong condemnation of this heinous and senseless crime. I need to say that the scenes that we've seen on TV are largely those of few kids on the streets. I cannot believe, and I do not think that there is anybody who would really condone such heinous crimes. And I have no doubt that the Palestinians, as the rest of the Arab world, joins the United States in condemning the attack and in really willing to do everything possible to help with all future moves.
As I recall, there was a report that your king was scheduled to come to America sometime this fall. Is that trip still on, so far as you know? In
fact, the king was on his way, and he could not land in the United States. He was in mid-air when these attacks took place, and he had to turn back and go back to Jordan because of the incidents.
Mr. Ambassador, this is going to be a trial for all parties, not just the United States, but Arab states in your part of the world, also for Israel and for right-thinking people everywhere. Do you think that there ought to be some extraordinary summit meeting of some kind to deal with this, what we now know is the cold, harsh reality of terrorism in our lives?
Absolutely. First of all, I need to say that Jordan has always cooperated very strongly with the United States in stemming terrorist attacks. The terrorist attacks that were about to take place during the turn of the millennium, Jordan played a key part in informing the United States about these attacks. We continue to hold very steadfast in our efforts to combat terrorism everywhere. We, of course, still do not know who did these crimes, and perhaps it is still early to tell. or assign blame. But whoever did them certainly deserves to be punished, I think.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us today. And we're sorry that King Abdullah was not able to make his trip to the United States, but perhaps he'll be able to do it later in the year. Thank you again for joining us. Maurice Dubois is in Paris. He works for WNBC here in New York. Maurice, Maurice, tell us what's been going on in the French capital.
Tom, I'm as stunned as anybody. My new wife and I were coming back to New York from our honeymoon from Charles de Gaulle Airport to Paris. We were halfway across the Atlantic between Paris and New York when the pilot got on and said we were turning around. And it almost sounded like one of those moments where he would, be kidding, like you've heard pilots joke around before. But it was obvious that he wasn't, and we turned around, and no one knew exactly what was going on for a good hour. And by the time he told us, and as the word spread throughout the plane, I mean, stunned doesn't even begin to describe how everybody reacted. And right now there's hundreds of people on the ground at Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport looking for places to stay for the night and looking for information, any shred of it we can find. People are gathering around television sets, commiserating. Rumors are flying. People aren't sure exactly what's going on, but here we are.
Television carrying this kind of wall-to-wall?
Exactly. As you would expect, like in the United States, the French are mulling it, trying to dissect it, trying to digest it. No one really has any idea. I mean, stunned is the only word I can think of, because I still am. I mean, we got off the plane about a half an hour ago. And we're still trying to make some sense of it.
All right, Maurice Dubois, who works for WNBC here in New York, who was returning from his honeymoon, and he was turned around over the Atlantic and returned to Paris because no planes were allowed to land in the United States. There's one report that transatlantic flights would be diverted to Canada. It was a fair amount of chaos today. We can only imagine what air traffic controllers were going through, especially when those 4 planes were hijacked almost simultaneously. And then it does appear that they tried to fly so low because they might have been trying to escape some radar detection on what they were up to, both in New York and in Washington, D.C. There were eyewitness accounts of the airliners going over Washington Square Park here in New York at a very low level, and also over Lafayette Square in Washington, in the heart of the Capitol, at a low level moments before they crashed into the Pentagon and into the Twin Trade Towers. Ken Allard is another one of our national security and terrorist experts, and he joins us now. Mr. Allard, we've been asking everyone all day long, and most experts have been saying, look, I did expect that there would be some kind of a terrorist incident, but uniformly, most people have been stunned by the magnitude of this one and how sophisticated it was.
Well, Tom, I have to say that I'm as stunned as anyone else, simply because of the fact that although we had seen the sophistication, apparently, of the Osama bin Laden network, being able to target 2 embassies in Africa almost simultaneously, the ability to put 4 teams into the air to hijack these airliners, the precision with which they executed this operation also suggests that it was extremely well planned. So again, the thing that I think has crumbled to the ground along, unfortunately, with the World Trade Center are some of our preconceptions about the nature of this challenge and, frankly, their ability to carry out operations within the United States.
What kind of extraordinary measures are going to have to be put in place besides beefing up security at the airports, in your judgment?
Well, Tom, life is going to change. I mean, not only are we going to see much more intrusive security at places like airports and other places where we gather in public, but we are also, I think, going to see some major changes in American foreign policy. We simply have to take another view of how we have fought terrorism. We have looked at this thing in terms of the criminal justice paradigm. In fact, the president said today that we're interested in bringing these people to justice. I think most Americans, once the shock fades, are less concerned about bringing them to justice than sending them to hell. And I really think that more than anything else, what you're going to see is a new seriousness about the nature of this challenge. We clearly need to be much more involved with the international community in a leadership capacity with it. But more than anything else, I think that life has changed both at home and abroad for the United States today.
Mr. Allard, do you think that we're going to have to go so far as to put armed undercover people on some of these commercial airliners? El Al has been doing that for a long time.
I think we'll probably see that. I think we'll see that sooner rather than later, simply because of the fact the last time that we went through this, back in the 1970s, we put sky marshals on board and it began to stop that whole rash of hijackings that we had had. We've gotten in this country, unfortunately, a little bit lax. Those of us that have spent any time at all traveling in Europe are constantly surprised when we get back to the United States to find that the standards are not quite the same. We've enjoyed, Tom, I think, a great deal of security and in this country without having to necessarily be worried about all these threats. Well, that's, again, one of the things that changed today in this country, and I don't think it's going to be back anytime soon.
Thank you very much. Ken Allard, who is a National Security Affairs Authority and an expert on terrorism as well, echoing what so many people have said today about how our lives are going to change and the magnitude of this attack, which has stunned almost all the authorities who have looked at this. They did expect some kind of a terrorist incident, but not anything as complex or as sophisticated or as effective in a most cold-blooded way as this one has been. We're going to go to the Pentagon now, I think. NBC Jim Miklashevsky.
Couple of issues that Ms. Clark addressed a few minutes ago. We didn't have good answers for. We do have a couple of them now. All of the service secretaries and all of the service chiefs are accounted for. Also, all military installations around the world are at Force Protection Condition Delta. D as in Delta. That's as high as it goes. Normally that is imposed on a local basis, but given the magnitude of the attacks today, it was directed worldwide. Those two things. Oh, there was a rumor earlier today, several hours ago now, that some F-16s or one F-16 had shot down some plane somewhere. That didn't happen. I cannot explain to you the cause of the crash of the airplane near Pittsburgh, but it was not engagement by a U.S. fighter aircraft.
What happened? What about fighter aircraft?
I don't have an estimate on that.
About the two so
there was a rumor hours ago that there was a fighter that had shot down an aircraft.
It's not. So the United States Air Force has not shot down an aircraft. Do you know anything about the plane? Correct.
Admiral Quigley, that was just a few moments ago on videotape. He was trying to confirm that all the service chiefs are in a secure location. So is the Secretary of Defense. He also said an F-16 did not shoot down anything. I had not heard that rumor. There have been a number of them flying around today. We've tried to share with you as best we can just what we have been able to confirm. There was a period of great uncertainty, obviously, in the early hours, but now, for several hours, the questions that we have primarily in our mind are how many people are still trapped and how many people may have been killed in the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon when those planes went down. We do know that the death toll from the hijacked planes, the passenger list and the crews, 266 altogether. On the phone with us now is the ambassador from Egypt, Nabil Sami, who joins us. Egypt, of course, has been one of those moderate Arab states that has been closely aligned with the United States. We have a strong military relationship. Mr. Ambassador, what has been the official reaction of your government to what happened here today?
We have unequivocally condemned this atrocious act. The President has publicly made a statement to that effect, and President Mubarak has also sent a condolence message to President Bush. The loss of life, innocent loss of life, whether they are civilians or military, is simply an atrocious event which we truly condemn.
And Mr. Ambassador, within your own country, you too have been targets of what I think you could fairly describe as Islamic radicals and terrorists. They have directed their rage against your government. Is there going to have to be some kind of a new effort internationally between countries that may not be necessarily aligned with each other ideologically to do something about this terrorism?
We faced the problem of terrorism quite seriously in the early 90s. It has subsided since then. We were quite ready and cooperative in holding different, engaging internationally on this issue. I think we will, needless to say, continue to do so. I would, nevertheless, at this point, refrain from getting into exact details until we see all of the information as to what exactly happened, where, and when. But this is truly something that we condemn.
Yeah, our correspondent in Tel Aviv, Martin Fletcher, reported that within recent days, the Egyptian government has been critical of the United States in the Middle East as the escalation of violence between Israel and the PLO has begun to take an ever higher toll. Has your government been critical of the United States?
Our relations with the U.S. are strong and frankly quite constructive, whether we agree or disagree on issues. That does happen. But nevertheless, we've urged the U.S. to play a more prominent, more high-profile role. That
one thing. This is not justifying in any way what we've seen here today.
Don't you think it's going to be more difficult for the United States to play that kind of a role if, in fact, we discover that these acts were committed by Islamic activists and radicals?
If, and I underline if, because, again, let's not forget that we've witnessed cases before where people have been accused of situations like this in Oklahoma, and this has proved not to be the case. But if these were acts of terrorists, they are terrorists, not reflective or representative of the people of the region. I'm aware of no Arab government that has in any way said anything but a severe condemnation of what we've seen here today.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much, and you're absolutely correct in that last declaration. All of the governments in the Middle East have uniformly condemned this, including the Taliban government in Afghanistan, denying that Osama bin Laden played any role in these attacks in New York City and in Washington, D.C. Osama bin Laden is widely regarded as the #1 terrorist in the world and is widely believed to be harbored within Afghanistan by the Taliban, although they have always denied that. Let's go to NBC's Robert Bazell, who has been staked out all day long at St. Vincent's Hospital, which is very close to the carnage in Lower Manhattan. I guess he's back now. Bob, what do we know about casualties at this point?
The casualties have certainly been there, Tom. I saw dead and mangled bodies myself. They've been coming in all day long in a steady stream. St. Vincent's Hospital, where I is the closest trauma center. However, an emergency plan went into effect today involving every one of the 190 hospitals in New York City. Hundreds of doctors and nurses turned out at every location. In Greenwich Village, which is where St. Vincent's Hospital there were so many people showed up to donate blood that some of them had to be turned away and taken to other hospitals. However, every physician that I spoke with said that this is just the beginning. There's kind of an eerie calm to the fact that they've even at one hospital seen only 250 injuries, about 30 of them serious. Everybody expects that there's a lot more people trapped under that rubble, and it's going to take a long time to get them out. The injuries have included just about everything. They've been massive trauma, the severe burns, smoke inhalation, and a very high percentage of them have been firefighters, police officers, and other emergency workers, because those people were very close in, especially when the second tower fell down. So we're going to see an enormous carnage, I think, among the people who were there to help today, Tom.
All right, thanks very much, NBC Robert Bazell. Bob, just let me ask you one other question. The nature of the injuries, I gather a lot of them were burns, and smoke inhalation was a huge problem, right?
Well, both smoke inhalation and a lot of trauma from falling stone and bricks from the collapsing buildings. So there was much more of a variety. They were comparing it at this hospital to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and most of the injuries there were from smoke inhalation because of the smoke was coming up from the basement. There was a very sad story at St. Vincent's Hospital where a nurse was emailing her husband, who was trapped on the upper floor of the second building, and the email stopped and she looked out the window and saw the building collapse.
Oh my God. You mean a nurse was at St. Vincent's Hospital, was on email to her husband?
So her husband was working in the hospital in the second tower, the remaining tower. He was emailing her that he was okay. They were back and forth. She was running off to do her duties. The emailing stopped. She looked out the building and saw the building collapse. It's one of what we're going to, I believe, thousands and thousands of stories like that happened in New York today, and we're going to hear many more.
Robert Bazell, thank you very much. A difficult duty all day long. We also heard the haunting tale of one of the people who was able to get out by running down some 50 stories. He saw people who were trapped in their wheelchairs, the large motorized kinds of wheelchairs, and of course with all the electrical circuits out, there was no way for them to get out of that building. It was in 1993, you'll remember, when we were all horrified by what we saw at the World Trade Center when a bomb went off in the parking garage. That was nothing compared to what happened here today. Both Twin Trade towers came down, 110 stories altogether. This now, almost 8 hours later, that's still the residue of smoke and dust and debris in the greatest skyline in the world, missing two of its most emblematic buildings. The trade towers that house not only Morgan Stanley, but government buildings, including the Secret Service has an office there, and the FBI and other institutions of the federal government are located there. We'll find out later, of course, but obviously the terrorist who attacked the building in 1993 Now they've come back, a group, perhaps the same alignment, perhaps a different one altogether, and attacked it more successfully by hijacking 2 planes and driving them into the building, either getting the controls themselves or forcing, and this seems hard to believe, a pilot to do that for them. We don't have the answers to so many of those questions. We'll only ask you to stay with us as we work our way through this long and difficult day that will change this country in so many ways. Mr. Standish from Jane's Intelligence Digest, Alex Standish, who's still with us from London. How can free democracies deal with terrorism even if they had the will to all get together and settle on one plan? Mr. Standish, can you hear me? Well, apparently we've lost our audio connection. Let's go back to Ken Allard, who joined us earlier from Washington. We saw him often during the Gulf War and in other times when there have been national security crises in this country, but nothing to measure up to this one. I think that it's fair to say, Mr. Allard, we've been describing this as an act of war. It is nothing less than that. It's the single most devastating attack on this country since Pearl Harbor. It is going to take an exceptional response, not only in tracking down and finding those responsible, but how we secure ourselves for that in the future. The question that I asked earlier, there are limits on democracy. Tony Lake said earlier we can't give up liberties to preserve our liberties.
Well, Tom, that's true. In trying to grope, for some historical perspective on this, and again, you've written a lot about World War II yourself. The thought that occurred to me was what Admiral Yamamoto said after Pearl Harbor. You remember he said that all that we have done is to waken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. And one would hope that that is exactly what's going to happen here. If the United States, if the American people, in the aftermath of this, can come together and basically support whatever has to be done, both in their internal security, in our internal security here, as well as probably some new directions abroad, that's probably the most that we can hope for. It is a day of tremendous tragedy. The only thing that you can hope for is that we react to this in the right way.
We did have to, during World War II and during the Civil War, give up certain liberties, at least for the short term. Do you think that that's going to be what's going to happen this time as well?
Well, Tom, there's no way to upset the American people any more than by telling them something that they have to do when they don't really want to. And that's true of any of us that try and rush through airports at the last minute. But, it's very, very clear that we're going to have to make some adjustments in the way that we think about these things, simply as the price of living in a much more turbulent world than I think many of us had fully realized up until today. That's going to involve not only those kinds of things, it's going to involve some very, very tricky questions for the FBI and the various other agencies that are going to be pursuing this investigation. Very simply because the fact that whatever the terrorists were that carried out this operation today had help within this country. And it's going to become an extremely difficult thing, and it's also very clear to me looking at this that some of what we have looked at before in terms of the judicial prohibitions, in terms of the judicial restraints, are going to have to be relooked again, simply in light of this new heightened sense of vulnerability that we have in this country.
Mr. Allard, thank you very much. We're going to now report on something that we've been holding for a time. We had heard earlier, and I alluded to this, that there could be some prominent people on board these planes. The plane that went from Dulles to Los Angeles, for example, and then was driven into the Pentagon. Ted Olson, who is the solicitor of the United States, he argued before the U.S. Supreme Court on behalf of George W. Bush. His wife, Barbara Olson, is a prominent legal commentator. We're now told by a number of their friends that she was on board the plane and called him from a cell phone saying, "We're being hijacked. Do you believe this?" And then the cell phone went dead. I think NBC's Tim Russert is standing by in Washington. He is not there now. At any rate, a number of their political friends on Capitol Hill and within the Washington establishment have been stunned by this news today. Barbara Olson was a very familiar figure on MSNBC and in conservative commentary circles. Her husband is a highly regarded lawyer. He was not on the plane. He is the Solicitor General of the United States. There was some small dispute over his confirmation, but then that was worked out quickly after George W. Bush took office. But you'll recall Barbara Olson was a bright, outspoken, extremely articulate, and passionate defender of her causes, with a keen sense of humor as well. And apparently she was on the plane and managed to get off a cell phone call to her husband. So our deepest sympathy, obviously, to the Olson family and to all those other families who had family members on the plane. We've also been told today that a man by the name of David Angel, who was the executive producer of Frasier, one of the most popular of the NBC television series, and his family were scheduled to return to Los Angeles from Cape Cod on the American Airlines flight that was hijacked and used in the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. This from his brother. So we are beginning to get now, unfortunately, but it's inevitable, the names and the count of the people who have died. Former President Clinton, who led the nation through the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, urged Americans today to rally behind President Bush in the aftermath of Tuesday's terrorist attack. He said, "We should not be second-guessing, we should be supporting him," he said in a telephone interview while traveling to Australia. He was stunned by what he saw, going on to say the most important thing is we all have to be strong, calm, good Americans now, and rally behind the president and support the actions that he doubtlessly will take in the days ahead in both rescue and reconstruction of the area, and especially in investigating and taking whatever action is necessary against those responsible. That according to President Clinton, who is traveling today in... let's go to Ken Allard. Now, Ken, just let me share with you something today. The Arab governments have uniformly condemned these attacks, and we have to be careful that there is a line of separation between these groups often and the governments who do try to act in responsible fashion.
Well, Tom, you know, as I said a moment ago, the thing that I think is probably very much in the United States' interest here is its reaction abroad to what has happened. There is never going to be such a thing as a silver lining in all these clouds. The most that you can hope for, though, is the fact that we can now begin to lead an international consensus against this kind of thing, and that involves making some very intelligent distinctions. We are not at war with the Islamic world or the Arab world in any sense at all. We are at war with a very narrow band of fanatical terrorists, and we need to keep those distinctions very firmly in our mind, because we're going to need the help of countries like Jordan. You had the ambassador on, also the ambassador from Egypt a couple of moments ago. Those are precisely the countries that we need the most to be along with us in whatever it is that we have to go do. I think the critical thing, though, is that from here on out, it's going to include the full range of American military power, as well as diplomatic, as well as justice.
Thank you very much, Ken Allard. And we also want to remind everyone that we ought not to engage in stereotypical attacks or jump to conclusions. The Council on American Islamic Relations is sending out an email calling on all Muslims to offer assistance to victims of the attack, while at the same time encouraging precautions for followers of the faith. This is part of what they said. They said those who wear Islamic attire should consider staying out of public areas for the immediate future. They request additional police patrols in the vicinity of mosques, of which there are many in America. Post mosque members at entrances and parking areas during prayer. Report suspicious packages to police. Document descriptions of suspicious people or vehicles. There are an estimated 7 million Muslims in America and some 1.2 billion worldwide. Islam, of course, is the fastest growing religion in the world. You'll recall that right after Oklahoma City, all the conclusions were that it was an Islamic terrorist of some kind. It was a homegrown American, Timothy McVeigh, with help of other American veterans of military service, for that matter. Mr. McVeigh now has gone to his just reward, and today we can only assume that this was a much more sophisticated terrorist attack, and because it is the Trade Center, which had been attacked before, most people are concluding that it did come from one of the more radical Islamic terrorist organizations, or terrorist organizations with or without the word Islamic. This is a live picture of Manhattan, looking across the harbor now at the lower end of the financial district. Until 9:42 this morning, you would see the gleaming twin towers of the World Trade Center, and then they were attacked, and within a few hours they went down. We're now told that President Bush is scheduled to leave Offutt, the Strategic Air Command headquarters, shortly for an undisclosed location. That's according to the press pool that does travel with the president. It travels in the back of Air Force One, the 747. Has been set up. There's another angle on the collapse of the trade towers. However many times you may look at it, it still boggles the mind. Belief is suspended, thinking, could this have happened? Was it some kind of a graphics animation of some kind? But we are living through a day, the 11th of September, 2001, that we will be dealing with for a good long time in our lives, and our children will be dealing with it as well in history books, if not in their own lives. Any number of people have pointed out that the 11th of September in shorthand is 9/11, and 9/11 was overtaxed today across this country in so many ways. Now, according to the press pool, Air Force One is headed back for the nation's capital. The President will be returning to Washington, D.C. It is important that business go on as best it can from our institutions of governance so that terrorists don't have the impression that they're putting this government on the run in some fashion. Amy Baker was in the World Trade Center when Bakehurst. Amy, are you there?
Yes, I'm right here. It's Dakers. Hello?
Tell me your last name.
Dakers, like Bakers, but D. Dakers.
Okay. Where were you?
I was in the 99th floor. In the 2 building.
In the 2 building. Was that was the first one hit?
No, the first. No, the 1 building was hit first.
Right.
And then after all building got hit.
When the first one got hit and you were just next door, what did you think?
I got so scared that my heart started beating so fast that I just everybody in our department just ran down the stairs.
Who did you work for?
A&R Services of New York. It's an insurance company.
And were you able to get all the way down 99 floors and out of the building before your building was hit as well?
No, we was on the 65th floor when our building got hit.
And what happened then? Were you in the stairwell?
Yes, we was in the staircase. Yes, we was.
And what did you think when the building got hit?
Oh my gosh, everybody got scared. Everybody got scared. We were all praying to God that we would make it out in time. We were all praying, and we just kept moving. We just kept running down the stairs. So we got out like in a nick of time.
And was it terribly crowded? And was there smoke?
Yes, it was. Oh yes, it was.
And water in the stairwell as well from the sprinklers?
Well, I didn't see no water because we were just running down the stairs, running on. The staircase was packed with people. We were just running down the stairs.
And when you got down and got out, what did you do then?
Well, they told us that they showed us exactly where to walk. So I was on Fulton Street, and then a few minutes later we just started running because the whole building collapsed after that. The whole building just came right down. So and the smoke was so intense that we was running. We ran all the way to the Brooklyn Bridge, just to get away from the smoke.
And what did you think when you turned around and saw the building coming down?
I said, oh my God, all those people in there. We were screaming. Everybody that was in there, we were screaming, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. We made it up, but all those people in there, we was crying. All those people in there. You know, it shook us up so bad. It shook us up.
What about your friends and the people that you know that work in the building? Were they all able to get out, Amy?
Well, the people in my department, I think everyone made it out safe, but I don't know about the rest of them. I mean, you know, I'm worried about them because I don't know if they made it out safe or oh God, or if they died or what. I don't even know.
Where are you now, Amy?
I'm home, but it's like I'm in my bed because my whole body is just shaking. My whole body is shaking. It's like I can't even move. It's just shaking.
Well, Amy, we're awfully glad that you're okay, and we thank you for sharing this terrifying story with us today. And we hope that your friends are going to all be okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Okay. That's a very vivid account of what so many people went through, and as she indicated, there were so many people left in the building when it came down. Bob Bazell telling us the chilling story of a nurse online with her husband who was still in the building, and then the building came down. There were people in wheelchairs. CNBC's Ron Insana was down in the area when the building came down itself, and even those who were in the immediate surrounding area were in great peril, Ron.
Absolutely, Tom. The billowing smoke that rushed through the streets of Manhattan really enveloped several of us who were trying to get around the World Trade Center and go down to the west side to hook up with NBC and CNBC crews. And it was so enveloping that the air around us turned jet black. You could not see. As I told you earlier in the day, I had the good fortune to find an unlocked car which I was hiding behind, really, to get away from the blowing winds. And as it got darker and darker, I crawled in and stayed there for several minutes until you could see some light again, and then managed to get inside a building as well and connected with a couple of police officers and some others. That video that you look at right now, in some ways does phenomenal justice to what it looked like, but as it's chasing you down the street, there's really no way to describe the feeling that you have trying to get away from the falling debris and the smoke and all the other materials that were flying through the air.
Were you able to breathe during that 2-minute period when it was just pitch black and the air was thick with smoke?
Luckily, the car that I was leaning against and kind of hiding behind was open, and I jumped in as soon as I could. It was very difficult breathing, and it was getting reasonably hot inside the car for lack of air. I don't believe that it was life-threatening, but it sure felt that way. I mean, there was no way to know what was going to happen next. We couldn't tell the trajectory of the building as it began to implode. We didn't know if it would fall on the surrounding buildings or just simply come straight down as it ultimately did. And you didn't know what was next. It was dark. It was impossible to see, hear. There's really no communication with anybody else for 3 or 4 minutes. And
Right.
Inside the building, it was certainly calmer, but again, people were panicked there as well.
All right, thank you very much.
Certainly.
CNBC's Ron Insana. In the Middle East today, the Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres was scheduled to meet with Yasser Arafat. Obviously, that meeting was called off. Yasser Arafat has condemned this attack in the United States in the strongest possible terms, and Foreign Minister Shimon Peres joins us now from the NBC Bureau in Tel Aviv. Has your government been in touch with President Bush, Mr. Peres?
No, we were in touch with the American ambassador. We have offered to send our rescue group, which is very trained on it. As a matter of fact, they're already on their way. You know, all of us feel today like being an American. Your pain is our pain, and we can imagine what's going over in the country. But it is the United States, again, that can again save the humanity. One of the greatest dangers to civilization, to our future. It's an attempt to bring us in a jungle where people will not be able to walk or to fly or to feel free. And I think there are ways and means to handle this challenge. And there is nobody better equipped, in spite of all the agonies, than the United States to lead again the world to become a more civilized and safer place.
Mr. Peres, there are going to be so many people who are worried that this act of war, and it is nothing less than this, on the United States will only have a polarizing effect, that it will not be in any way a means to get countries together and right-thinking people in all of the world, including in your very volatile part of the world, to come to some common agreement against terrorism.
I don't think so. I think that the ones among the Arabs who are engaged in terror will today understand that this is the end of the story. They cannot go ahead with it. And I think the world has to get itself organized with the leadership of the United States to identify countries or organizations which are hosting or supporting or financing this terrible form of terror. I think also leaders, religious leaders, spiritual leaders, newspapermen, political figures have to condemn with a full heart the appearance of suicidal murders, which really cause the same damage like in Pearl Harbor. They shouldn't be permitted. It's against the gospel. It's against everything we stand for. And I see it as a world struggle that concerns each of us individually, and I believe we can manage and handle it, no matter if you're an Arab or a Jew or an American.
And what about the conduct of the Israeli government in its continuing conflict with the PLO and with Yasser Arafat. Is that going to be changed as a result of all of this?
That's my hope. We are telling today the Arabs and the Palestinians, look, today it's the chance to depart from terror completely and fully and go back to the district of negotiations, of understanding. Nothing will be solved by weapons and killings, and everything that was solved in the past and may be solved in the future is around the negotiating table.
Have you had any contact with Chairman Arafat today or with his representatives?
What I'm telling you, we let them know as well.
Has there been any rescheduling of the meeting that you were supposed to have today with the chairman?
Not yet, but first of all, let us see what will happen. I hope the Palestinians will use this terrible occasion in order to free from themselves from the mistake of being engaged in acts of terror and destruction.
Shimon Peres, the foreign minister of Israel, a man who's been prominent in that country's leadership, regardless of the government, for so many years. Thank you very much for being with us here today.
Thank you.
Foreign Minister of Israel, who was scheduled to meet today with Yasser Arafat. To bring you back up to date on a couple of matters, President Bush en route from Omaha, Nebraska, Offutt Air Force Base, which is south of Omaha, the Strategic Air Command headquarters, after a National Security Council meeting via teleconferencing. He's now en route back to Washington, D.C. The President was in Florida this morning for an education and literacy event when Andy Card whispered in his ear that there had been a second attack on the World Trade Center. He issued a strong statement, then left there, flew to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, from there to Offutt. Let's listen for just a moment to what the President had to say today.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with...
That's President George W. Bush, who was speaking at that time from Louisiana. Then he went on to Omaha, and he's now on his way back to Washington, D.C. His counselor, Karen Hughes, speaking from the FBI, said that all of the federal agencies had their ongoing operations plans in effect, and the government was performing as best could be expected under the circumstances. Banks did stay open today, even though the financial markets were shut down here in New York City. The Cabinet Secretary for Transportation, Norm Mineta of California, had moved to the command center at the White House with Dick Cheney and Condoleezza Rice, who was the National Security Advisor, because obviously transportation was such a critical component of all of this, with 4 airplanes hijacked today. All air travel canceled until tomorrow. No more takeoffs from any airports until noon tomorrow. All other flights did arrive safely. A number of international flights that were headed this way were diverted, either going back to their original destination or their point of origin, or they were sent to other places. There was one report that the border between the United States and Mexico had been closed today. It turns out that there was just enhanced security at that airport. The border for a time between Canada and the United States near Windsor, Ontario, just across the river from Detroit, that was closed today as well. There was a great deal of confusion. Precaution was the order of the day until they could sort out what was real, what was rumored, what was likely to happen next. It all happened within about an hour this morning, between 8:45 Eastern Time and about 9:45, the attack on the Twin Towers of the Trade Center, the Pentagon, and then the plane that was crashed into the ground outside of Pittsburgh. We don't know what its original destination or target may have been. 266 people on board these airliners today, including Barbara Olson, a prominent commentator from Washington, D.C., the wife of the Solicitor General of the United States, Ted Olson, who made the successful argument for President Bush before the U.S. Supreme Court. There is Barbara Olson, a very familiar figure on political talk shows and also a writer in Washington. They were one of the sparkling couples in Republican circles, great lovers of the opera, loved to give good dinner parties, and they were the bright lights in the Bush administration's social life, as well as being two highly skilled lawyers. Barbara Olson was on the plane that was crashed into the Pentagon. She managed to get a cell phone call off to her husband, and then the line went dead after she said, "Can you believe this? We're being hijacked." I'm sure that no one on those planes thought that they were going to be not only hijacked, but used in effect as a guided missile, a different kind of a cruise missile, to attack the institutions of governance that they have defended in the past. We're looking now at New York City, earlier photos of what was going on in the lower part of Manhattan, awaiting the president's return to Washington, D.C., and where he will be going. There's a 40-story building that is near the Trade Center that is in danger of collapsing as well because of the shock of the explosion that was coincidental with the two towers coming down. 40 fire companies, we're told, are in the immediate area. Well, there were 40 fire companies in the immediate Trade Center area just before the towers collapsed. The great fear is that many of those of New York's finest were lost in that debris and all that rubble and the force of that explosion. Pat Dawson, downtown. Pat, can you bring us up to date on the emergency efforts that are underway?
Well, at this point, Tom, literally hundreds of rescue workers are waiting to go in there. The problem for the authorities here, of course, is when can you send them in there? We are told by Port Authority officials that they are unable to send people actually into the debris of the building. However, they do have people on the perimeter, on the along the sides of the building, and they've been able to look there. There are still fires burning in there. We were told by somebody that was down there a little while ago that there were still fires burning in some areas of those buildings. Now, as we stand here, probably a good 6 to 7 hours after the buildings came down. Obviously a very, very difficult circumstance and a big challenge for rescue officials here as to exactly when to go in there. As we discussed earlier, the problem that they have, of course, is when can they go in to search for survivors and yet still not put the rescuers themselves, many of whom, no doubt, from earlier this morning are casualties of the first events of the day, not put those rescue workers into danger themselves. So that is obviously the problem. We were told by a couple of people that were in there before rescue workers that there are bodies, a number of bodies lying around in the debris and on the street there. Obviously, part of the job will be to bring them out. We are also told by Port Authority officials that the building over there, which is building number 7, which you can see, it is referred to as building number 7. It's about, I would say probably a 20-story building, that there is some concern on the part of Port Authority officials about the stability of that building at this point. So obviously, as we have been discussing all day, a very, very difficult circumstance here as to exactly when that area really is going to be truly secure. Tom?
All right, Pat Dawson, I want to bring everybody up to date on a kind of a national roundup because while the specific targets were in Washington, D.C. and in New York City, it did have a devastating effect around this country. In terms of transportation, you know that all airports were shut down nationwide. They will remain shut down until noon tomorrow. Also, all vessels on navigable waters are under command of the Secretary of Transportation. Greyhound canceled all bus service in the Northeast. Amtrak temporarily suspended train service along the Northeastern Corridor. Sections of the U.S. section of the St. Lawrence Seaway were closed. Manhattan subway lines, most of them were shut down. There was later service, limited service so people could get out of the lower part of Manhattan. Security for Great Lakes shipping tightened. Coast Guard inspecting ships at St. Mary's River, which links Lake Huron and Lake Superior. Flat tops aircraft carriers were moved from the waters off Virginia up into the New York area. The tunnel between Detroit and Windsor, Ontario was closed to car traffic. Security tightened at all U.S.-Canada border crossings. Ports of entry along the U.S.-Mexico border remain open, but there's a high security alert. Space shuttle operations were halted in Florida. 12,000 employees at the Space Center were sent home. Non-essential personnel from the Naval Weapons Station Center in Goose Creek, South Carolina, evacuated. 1,700 workers at the Space and Naval Warfare Systems sent home. Oklahoma police created a one-block perimeter around the jail where the bombing conspirator Terry Nichols has been housed and is awaiting trial with the possibility of facing the death sentence on state charges. As you know, all financial markets in New York City were closed down, including the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, and the Chicago Board of Trade, although most banks remained open today. Heightened monitoring at all bridges and dams, including Grand Coulee and Hoover Dam. At the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, heightened security. The UN building was evacuated. General Motors gave its 6,000 employees the day off in Detroit. Ford Motor Company closed world headquarters in Dearborn. The Internal Revenue Service in Michigan closed down. Sears Tower in Chicago shut down. The 51-story IDS Center in Minneapolis shut down. New York City's mayoral primary, which was scheduled for today, was postponed. All Major League Baseball games were postponed today. Walt Disney World in Florida was shut down. Philadelphia, the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall were closed. Space Needle in Seattle closed and evacuated. Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York closed, and a number of entertainment and theme parks in California were closed, as well as the New Mexico State Fair. That's just what we know about what was going on around the country. Obviously, a lot of people were glued to their television sets or listening to radio or dealing with this national crisis in one form or another. Let's go to NBC's Dan Abrams now. Dan, what do you have for us? Dan Abrams, are you there?
Tom, can you hear me?
Yes.
I am here. Okay. As you can see, Tom, behind me, the smoke still billowing from the area where the Trade Center was. There's still concern about a building right there where there is a fire still going, and the police here still concerned that that building, too, may be in jeopardy. They continue to push the crowds back. A block, another block, another block. They remain concerned that that building could fall as well. They're concerned about the way the wind has been moving. I'm joined now by Sergeant Moses Cruz from the New York City Police Department, who was there during both of the buildings falling. Describe, first of all, what you saw when the first building fell.
Well, I heard the rumbling. I looked up, and then I saw the top of the building just collapsing down.
And immediately, what did you do? I mean, you're a New York City police officer. You're seeing the World Trade Center coming down. What did you do?
Well, first reaction was, oh God. In other words, though. Then I turned around and started yelling for people to run.
And as you're telling people to run, shortly thereafter, the second building then comes down.
That was half an hour later.
Half an hour later.
The initial collapse was we started running, then the smoke caught up to me. As you can see, everything's just, actually I'm clean now compared to what I was before. And then you couldn't really breathe, you couldn't see anything.
And what was the most important thing you were trying to get people to do? It was just leave?
Yeah, just run, get out of the way.
And were most of the people running in a pretty orderly fashion?
Oh yeah, they were running, but then the smoke that caught up to them, a lot of people were collapsing, they were having trouble breathing.
But there were people collapsing literally on the ground in front of the building?
Yeah, actually, I was like a block away, so they were actually collapsing as they were trying to run.
Okay. Well, Sergeant Cruz, thanks very much for joining us. We appreciate it. And we appreciate all the work you're doing there. Tom, there are triage centers set up here on both sides. I'm sort of in the middle area. On both to the east and the west of me, there are triage centers, and in fact, there's one place where a school bus has been converted into an ICU. So, Tom, as you can see, the issues continue here. More people coming in and coming out. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's Dan Abrams. We're coming up now on about 8 hours since that first attack that stunned everyone on the World Trade Center. We did know it was an attack at the time. We were only told that a plane had hit one of the towers as people were rushing all across New York City trying to get to jobs like mine, and Katie and Matt were on the air with the Today Show. Then there was a report of a second plane hitting the other trade tower, and we understood that this was no longer the possibility of a bad aviation accident, that was very likely a terrorist attack. And then about 45 minutes later, of course, the Pentagon was hit. And we began to hear from United and American Airlines that not all of their flights could be accounted for. We did know that it was American Airlines flight 11 that had left Boston, that had hit the first tower. And then we began to hear that a flight from Newark to Los Angeles was missing in action, in effect. Also a flight from Dulles. It was that kind of a day. It was a day of surrealism and disbelief, but the cold, hard reality that this country was, in effect, in a terrorist war, the most severe attack in America since Pearl Harbor. In the eyes of a lot of people, a more devastating attack because we don't know who did it. And these were terrorists who used innocent people as weapons. Katie and Matt will be here momentarily. I'll see you again at 6:30, and we'll be on throughout the evening on this NBC station. There's so much more to come on this devastating day in America.
I spent a year in combat. I never saw anything like this. Saw a lot of people die. Nothing this devastating.
We carried a bunch of people that we found laying in the debris. There was complete darkness. We stumbled over some people. We picked them up and carried them across the street.
You could hear the rumbling. When you looked up, you could see the top of the building just crumbling.
I heard the sound of the rumble, and I ran. I heard the rumble, and I just heard the rumble, and then I ran like hell, and there was a large wind coming.
It started from the train. There was a gentleman on the cell phone who just started screaming that the planes had hit into the World Trade Center, and everyone in the car ran over to the other side, and we could see the burning and the big hole through the Trade Center. And as soon as we got out of the train station, people were screaming and crying and yelling, and it was just total chaos.
I was in the building when they announced that there was a fire, and they evacuated the World Trade Center. And then when we got outside, you looked up and we saw flames and smoke. And then as we were moving away from the building, I heard, a loud explosion, and, saw the second tower caught in flames. And at that point, everybody started running.
In the second tower, was like something went in and came out the other side, and a huge, huge fireball. And that was it. And then we left our building, we evacuated, and we're walking around for the last 2 hours.
I've been to Turkey, the earthquake 2 years ago in Turkey, 19,000 people died, and Bosnia and Macedonia, a number of places in the world. And this is certainly, when you start talking to a New York police officer and they start crying for what they've seen in the last couple hours, you know the seriousness and the gravity of the situation.
I was there when the tower, it just rained building, okay? And I was buried alive for 15 minutes until I scrambled out. And I'm just very concerned about the 6 firemen who were with me because I'm not sure they all made it.
3 hours or this could happen. 3 hours. I don't know if I was going to live or die within 3 hours. So I just thank God I am alive. So I can say. I hope my coworkers are too.
For those of you joining us, it is 5 o'clock Eastern Time, and you are joining a live special of NBC News on the attack on America. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matt Lauer.
And I'm Katie Couric. It's been more than 8 hours since the first plane hit the World Trade Center tower this morning. We do know the devastation is unfathomable, but at this hour there is much we still do not know. For example, it is unclear how many people have died here in New York or at the Pentagon, where another jet crashed this morning as well. In Manhattan, it's believed that thousands of people may have been killed or injured, but a definitive number may not be known for days or even weeks. We do know 266 people died on board 4 airliners hijacked and turned into deadly weapons this morning.
This is the scene again right now on the southern tip of Manhattan. The twin towers of the World Trade Center have been wiped from the New York skyline. The towers collapsed within minutes of one another after the astonishing and horrifying attack early this morning. The country's financial center disappeared under a carpet of rubble, smoke, and choking clouds of dust. The size and scope of this attack, unimaginable. Within minutes of the 2 attacks, at the World Trade Center, another hijacked jet slammed into the helipad, which is only a few feet from the Pentagon, destroying one wing of that building. There are many casualties there as well. One congressional leader called it a second Pearl Harbor. About an hour ago, President Bush's communications chief had this to say.
This is a News 10 NBC special report.
Good evening, I'm Janet Lomax.
I'm Gabe Domelt. We interrupt NBC's special coverage of this horrible disaster to bring you the latest locally.
But we are continuing to monitor any breaking developments. We go live to Brian Martin, who's in our newsroom. Brian.
Well, Janet and Gabe, this all started just before 9 o'clock this morning. It's a story that's been unfolding all day. I'm here in the 10 NBC newsroom watching several televisions, several monitors, also checking out the AP Wire to make sure you are kept up to date on this issue. And we will not hesitate to go back to national coverage for any breaking news. Now, here at home, we spoke with one Rochester native who now lives in the city. Chris Hernandez is a student and a web designer now living in New York City, downtown Manhattan. We spoke with him by phone, and here's what he had to say.
So I went up to my rooftop. I'm only about a quarter of a mile from the World Trade Center. I'm actually in Lower Manhattan. I went to my rooftop. It's about 6 flights up, and I saw the second airplane flew over my head and slammed, sort of clipped the second building.
Now, we spoke with Hernandez just moments ago, probably about an hour ago, and he says in addition to all the emergency crews that are there in New York City helping out, people are literally helping one another out to try to get through this horrible tragedy. Reporting live in the newsroom, Brian Martin, News 10 NBC.
Brian, shortly after the attacks, the Federal Aviation Administration grounded all flights, closed all airports nationwide. Some planes in the air during the time of the crisis were diverted here to Rochester. Kristen Salome now joins us live from the airport with the latest. Kristen?
Well, Gabe, as you can see, the airport here is completely closed to the public. There is extra security on high alert here. Those planes you mentioned that were rerouted here to Rochester, they were in the air at the time of the attack. There were 2 of them. All of those passengers have since been bused to Boston and Hartford, Connecticut. Also, passengers on at least 6 other planes had to return to Rochester shortly after takeoff here. Most air travelers didn't realize the full extent of what happened until they came back into the terminal and began watching the TV monitors. Airport officials can't tell us how many passengers are stranded in local hotels. We do know there was a run on rental cars here at the airport today. But honestly, I heard few complaints from people who are stranded. The overwhelming emotion here all day has been one of shock. A lot of people came here this morning from New York City, including one man who works on the 100th floor of the World Trade Center towers.
I'm out of words right now because I have a lot of friends and office mates that are in that building, and I'm worried about their welfare and where they are right now.
I flew out of Westchester Airport and seen the smoke. I knew it was from downtown New York. I didn't know quite what it was, but it was pretty obvious it was something.
My husband was just leaving here and flying to Atlanta, and we were supposed to meet up in Austin at about 2 o'clock this afternoon. So I'm sitting here thinking, where's my husband?
Now, if you are trying to reach someone who was flying today, airport officials tell us the best thing to do is call the airlines directly. They can tell you where flights have been rerouted. The airport here and others around the country will not reopen until at least noon tomorrow. Of course, we'll keep you posted throughout the evening. Reported live from the airport, Kristen Salome, News 10, NBC.
Well, much of downtown Rochester shut down almost completely building mid-morning when the county entered a state of emergency. The evacuations took place all over the city at places like the county courthouse and the public safety building. Workers also cleared out of the federal building. Guards stood outside making sure people stayed away.
My reaction is you would never think that this would happen in the U.S. I mean, this is like we have combat right now in the backyard at this point. I mean, it's very sad to hear.
I don't know. It's kind of scary, and you know, so I mean, it's just scary. So I just want to go home. So
it's scary. This is scary. It's like I'm just like shaking right about now. I can't believe it. I heard it on the way to work. And then it's like more and more things are just happening, one after another.
We do want to point out none of the buildings evacuated were threatened in any way.
Rural Metro ambulances on standby tonight in Rochester, prepared to respond. All employees and officers are on alert in case EMS support is needed in New York City. Officials say there's also heightened awareness locally as well because Rochester is home to several large multinational companies. All Red Cross trained personnel are also on alert. The local Red Cross is organizing teams of people from across the state to respond to New York City. A command center is open at its offices on Prince Street. The Red Cross is pledging to aid the victims of today's tragedy by supplying blood. Local donors were lined up outside the Prince Street Donor Center just a few hours after the World Trade Center bombing. The Red Cross says half the local blood supply will be sent to New York City as needed. Donor centers will offer extended hours all week long. Local residents can call 1-800-GIVE-LIFE to find out about donating blood. Also, if you wish, you can make a financial contribution to help those in need. You can call that number 241-4417 for more information.
Many local schools have canceled evening activities. Here's a look at other major closings you should know about. All area shopping malls just closed at 5 o'clock. The Stevie Nicks concert at Blue Cross Arena is canceled tomorrow night. Nazareth College, St. John Fisher, SUNY Brockport, and Geneseo have canceled night classes. You can log on to our website at 10nbc.com for a complete listing of those closings. Coming up at 6, local religious centers are on heightened alert after today's attacks. Plus, we'll go back to the airport and talk with travelers who actually spent time with some of the passengers on those hijacked planes.
Of course, we, along with NBC News, are continuing to follow all and any new developments.
We go back now live to NBC's coverage.
The National Security Team and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status. And we have taken the necessary security precautions to continue the functions of your government. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them that we will do whatever is necessary to protect America and Americans. I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested, but make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
Those were the remarks of President Bush earlier today. We want to go now to Washington, where NBC's Campbell Brown is standing by at the White House. Campbell?
Well, Matt, the president, as you mentioned earlier, is now on his way back to Washington, and we are expecting him to address the nation tonight from Washington, D.C. We don't know exactly where that will be from, whether it will be from the White House or exactly what time yet. But he is on his way here from the Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, and that is the headquarters for the National Strategic Air Command. And he was in a bunker there that has the most sophisticated communications equipment, and it was from there that he was able to meet with his national security team by a live video teleconference. As you heard the president say, he's been in close contact all day with his national security team. They are, or the key personnel are, still at the White House. The White House was, of course, evacuated earlier today. Around 9:30 this morning, staff left the White House. They were running from their offices across Pennsylvania Avenue, and this entire area where we are, Matt, around the White House is fairly desolate right now. Most of the office buildings were also evacuated. But top personnel were allowed to stay at the White House, Vice President Cheney, as well as National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, and they are operating there out of what's called the Situation Room. And it's a wood-paneled room in the basement of the West Wing, secure with the highest security level and latest communications equipment. There's a big conference room there with video screens where the Vice President and the National Security Team, and presumably shortly the President, can sit and basically hear communications and intelligence from all over the world. It will likely be Command Central from here on out. Now, in addition to his National Security Team, we've been told the President also today spoke with New York Mayor Giuliani and New York Governor Pataki. He's also been in contact with his wife, First Lady Laura Bush, and the Bush daughters were also taken to an undisclosed secure location. Matt?
Campbell, I know there were some tense moments there earlier when that fourth plane that had been hijacked was unaccounted for, and there were some fears that perhaps it was headed for another site in Washington in addition to the Pentagon. Campbell Brown, thank you very much. Katie?
All right.
let's now turn to Jim Miklashevsky, who is at the Pentagon. Mick was actually there when an American Airlines Boeing 757, American Airlines Flight 77, en route from Washington Dulles Airport to LAX with 64 people aboard, actually crashed into the Pentagon. Mick, why don't you tell folks, we were talking with you and trying to get an explanation as to what Pentagon officials were saying about the World Trade Center when suddenly you heard an explosion yourself.
That's right, Katie. We were trying to figure out exactly how the U.S. military intended to respond to what even they were characterizing as an obvious coordinated terrorist attack against the World Trade Center. Just about that time, the Pentagon was putting together a crisis action team to further assess any possible additional threats to either New York or Washington, D.C. When suddenly there in the Pentagon booth, fortunately on the other side of the building, the entire building shook, the windows rattled. I looked outside to see construction workers running, and in the hallways it was pandemonium. It quickly filled with smoke. And as you can see behind me, Katie, a scene that is eerily reminiscent of the federal building bombing in Oklahoma City, with the gaping hole and the slanting floors that collapsed in on each other. And for those who don't know how the Pentagon is constructed, I'm going to have to compete with the helicopter, one of the rescue helicopters that's taking off right now. But the Pentagon is constructed in 5 separate rings. What you see out here is the most outer ring, or the E ring. The plane impacted with such a force that it actually penetrated deep into the building into 3 separate rings. First the E ring, then through an open space, the D ring, another open space, and finally into the C ring. The actual plane, when it went into the building, punched a gaping hole in the first 2 floors. The upper floors were still intact, but in the ensuing fire, they eventually collapsed on themselves, and actually burying any additional hopes that additional survivors could be found alive. It took 4 hours for Arlington, Virginia firefighters to bring the blaze under control, to allow rescuers to get anywhere close to the devastated area to search for additional survivors. You see behind me now, lined up is a lot of search and rescue and recovery equipment, huge cranes. In those buses were some rescue teams from various emergency agencies from around the area. They donned their backpacks, emergency oxygen bottles, and headed for the building and the devastation you see behind us. There are many confirmed dead, scores confirmed injured, but the Pentagon does not yet have an actual casualty count. It could be hours, maybe even days, before they finally get that. Katie?
Mick, I understand that the U.S. military, as you well know, is on a state of high alert. Explain to people what exactly that means.
Okay, Katie, I think you were asking about the state of alert. Here at the Pentagon, it immediately went to the highest state of alert, Delta. And we're told now that all American forces around the world have been put at the absolute highest state of alert, which is actually a virtual state of war. They are manning weapons that are loaded. They are fully protected in whatever, in their helmets and their flak vests, preparing for the absolute worst. And throughout the day, this was kind of an eerie sight too. Throughout the day, we saw U.S. Air Force F-16 flying low cover over the city. And as one Air Force officer was standing by me looking up, said, "My God, we're now flying cover over the nation's capital."
We've heard actually those very same planes, or what appears to appear to be military planes, flying over Manhattan as well, Mick. Now, we understand that the flight that crashed near Pittsburgh was actually targeting Camp David. Is that your understanding?
That's what we're hearing from Pentagon officials, but no confirmation of that. And I must put a rumor to rest. There were rumors that an Air Force F-16 actually shot down that jet. Pentagon officials have said categorically that is not the case. There may have been an explosion aboard that jet before it crashed. but there was no U.S. Air Force plane involved in shooting down that airliner, which, as you say, appeared to have been headed for Camp David, perhaps out of Pittsburgh.
All right, Jim Miklashevsky. Jim, thank you very much under very difficult circumstances. Thank you, Mick.
All right, obviously, Bob Hager is NBC's expert on aviation. He joins us now. Bob, I have a couple of questions for you. First of all, we know that some people, or a couple of people on board the planes that were hijacked, did manage to get cell phone calls to people on the ground. Do we know if there was any communication between the cockpit crew of those flights and any ground control personnel?
We don't. They would be able to press a button in the cockpit and indicate that they were being hijacked, send out a special code. We don't know if they managed to get off any actual audio transmissions of any of this. But, oh, there's a picture of the actual plane hitting the World Trade Center, the South Tower. That's the United flight that came out of Boston. It had 65 people aboard. That was the second crash of the day. It came just 17 minutes after the first crash. You were asking about cell phone accounts. I want to treat this very carefully. It's unconfirmed information. There is an unconfirmed report that an American Airlines flight attendant was on a cell phone with her operations people describing some of what went on in one of these flights, the flight that went down in rural Pennsylvania, and that she said that the crew had been shot, and then a flight attendant was stabbed in the aisle of the plane, and then they lost contact with her before this reached its culmination in the crash. Now, again, that's an unconfirmed report. American Airlines has not confirmed it. It comes from an American Airlines source, but again, it's unconfirmed through official channels at American Airlines. It's not hard to imagine in this day and age that several people of different passengers and/or crew may have been able to make cell phone calls, because that frequently happens with disabled planes in this day and age. All traffic has been grounded in the U.S. That's the first time that that has ever happened in history. It was called as of 9:30 this morning. Planes that were in the air were allowed to land later. The last of them had landed by mid-afternoon, and presumably at that point, federal officials felt that the immediate threat was over. However, they're going to keep the lid on all commercial airline traffic at least until noon tomorrow, and then they'll reassess. So how could this happen? Well, you can only get aboard a plane. Terrorists can only get aboard two ways, either through the X-ray screening, the passenger screening devices, or by sneaking through one of the doors using a magnetic card, or managing to go in behind an employee into a off-limits area such as a baggage room, working your way around onto the tarmac, or even people have done it onto empty planes. The FAA tests for that kind of thing all the time, and sadly, the results of those tests have been poor. Using plainclothes people as testers, they've shown that they are able to get through X-rays, X-ray screening with fake guns, fake explosives, quite frequently. And in the most recent test of the doors that are supposed to be secure doors, over 2/3 of the testers who tried it were able to get through. Then once on board, the question comes up, would it be a hijacker holding a gun or an explosive to a pilot's head, forcing them to do something, or would it be more likely they would have disabled the crew and taken over the controls themselves, in which case they would have had to know how to fly a 767 or a 757. Much more apt to be the latter, people say, in order to hit something like the World Trade Center with that exact precision. Matt?
Bob, let me ask you another question. There was a ground hold. Presumably thousands of people were on planes, perhaps even sitting on tarmacs at airports across the country. Do you know if there was any effort, Bob, to check the passengers on those planes who were planning to take off at about the same time as these 4 hijacked planes took off this morning?
I have not heard of anything like that. In other words, I see your point there, to see if there were any more hijackers sitting on planes that had been stopped. And I've not heard of that, so I think there probably wasn't. But it's instructional that these planes, all 4 of them, they were scheduled anyway to take off within 25 minutes of each other. So this problem came on people so fast, and remember, it wasn't until after the second explosion that people really began to get the idea that these were hijacked aircraft going into buildings. So even though the FAA would have, and we don't know this, but we presume they would have had these codes to tell them hijackings were in progress, it would have taken a little while to put all this information together. So that's part of how sophisticated this all was.
All right, Bob, and one final question for you. There has been speculation that perhaps it was intentional that all of these planes, the two from Boston, the one from Newark, the one from Washington Dulles, were headed transcontinental flights, so they were carrying a lot of fuel, and the speculation has been that the terrorists chose those planes exactly because of that fuel, correct?
Just in my opinion, I think that's a foregone conclusion. That it just is too coincidental that all too remarkable to be coincidental that all 4 of those flights should be bound. 3 of them for Los Angeles, 1 for San Francisco.
I can't hear anything.
So it does seem as though they were chosen because they'd have a full load of fuel, and that would make the plane much more explosive when it hit.
All right, Bob Hager, thank you very much, Bob. We're looking at some live pictures right now in Lower Manhattan, very close to the World Trade Center, where we understand another building has now collapsed. Pat Dawson is standing by in that area. Pat, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you fine. If you remember, about no more than 20 to 25 minutes ago, we were talking about another building in the World Trade Center that officials here were very worried about, that they thought it might collapse. I referred to it as Building 7, and it used to be just over to the left of that white modern building down there. It literally was poking right above that, probably about a 20 to 25-story building. Moments ago, that building literally gave way and collapsed into the street down there. So that would be the 3rd building in the World Trade Center complex that has collapsed today. That's what all the smoke that you see there now is. It literally is coming all the way up Manhattan here, probably another 10 or 15 blocks. The smoke from that collapse. That was a very large, probably, I'm guessing here, maybe a 20-story building that just collapsed there. As we have been saying all along, the most difficult part for officials here and for rescuers here is when can they go back, when can they start to go in there and investigate who is alive and who is dead. One of the reasons that they have not been able to go in there in large numbers is because they were afraid of exactly that. And no more than an hour and a half ago, we were told by Port Authority officials that they were afraid that there was another building in the complex. We later learned it was Building 7, the one we showed you a half hour ago, and just moments ago, that building collapsed. Matt?
Pat Dawson, hi, it's Katie. I was just curious, are there any other buildings in danger of collapsing in that general vicinity?
When we spoke to the Port Authority officials, as I said, probably in the last hour and a half, they indicated that they were worried about a couple of buildings, but really they concentrated on Building 7. That is the one that just fell literally moments ago. They didn't indicate that they specifically thought that there was another building that was in trouble. They just said they were nervous, in their words, about a couple of buildings, and then specifically cited Building 7, which is the building that we just referred to. Katie.
All right, Pat Dawson. Pat, thank you very much. Meanwhile, Dan Abrams is on the telephone, apparently at the scene. Dan, what can you tell us?
Well, hi there, Katie. I'm standing about 5 or 6 blocks away from where that building just collapsed. The one piece of good news is...
Okay, obviously we have lost contact with Dan Abrams, who is nearby the building. As he said, that just collapsed. We'll try to maintain contact with him in just a few minutes. Meanwhile, Osama bin Laden is a name that we have been hearing all day long as an individual who may, and we emphasize may, be responsible for these terrorist acts. It is a name we have heard before as well. Hoda Khatbi has this report.
The early focus is on guerrilla leader Osama bin Laden because of the level of logistics necessary to carry out today's series of attacks. Bin Laden is a millionaire Saudi businessman believed to be living in exile in Afghanistan. U.S. officials link bin Laden to numerous terrorist attacks, including last year's bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen. He was blamed for the 1998 bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, in which 224 people died. And one of his top lieutenants was convicted this year of plotting to bomb the Los Angeles International Airport at the turn of the millennium. An Arab journalist with access to bin Laden told Reuters that the guerrilla leader had warned just 3 weeks ago of a, quote, unprecedented attack on U.S. interests. Since 1998, he has declared all U.S. citizens legitimate targets of attack. The tall, thin bin Laden's goal, in his own words, is to unite all Muslims and establish a government which follows Islamic law. His network supports terrorists in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Chechnya, Somalia, Yemen, and Kosovo. We should note, though, that just hours after the attacks, Afghanistan's hardline Taliban rulers condemned them, rejecting suggestions that bin Laden is behind them.
Meanwhile, NBC's Andrea Mitchell is at the State Department this afternoon. Andrea, what are State Department officials saying about the possibility that this is the man responsible for these attacks?
Usually they are very cautious about drawing these conclusions. Since the State Department was evacuated, Katie, I'm here in our newsroom and talking to national security officials, intelligence officials, and others in the government. They now believe that bin Laden was responsible. They have seen some evidence since the attack this morning pinning this on those involved with bin Laden's organization. A global organization that George Tenet has been warning Congress is the one organization capable of multiple attacks with no warning. This is his MO. This is the way he, according to the indictment and the arrest warrant, was able to attack both the embassy in Tanzania and in Nairobi, Kenya, almost simultaneously. It is a requirement of a great deal of coordination, of money, of expertise, a global terror network, if you will, which has been almost unique to bin Laden. So while he was immediately under suspicion, we are now told from top U.S. officials that they have seen evidence, which we can presume is some sort of electronic eavesdropping evidence, that in fact bin Laden was in some way responsible for this. That is certainly their operational theory. And regarding Hoda's report, the Taliban leaders of Afghanistan would be well advised to deny any complicity because they've been harboring him within weeks. Only weeks ago, U.S. officials warned the Taliban that if anything happened to the U.S., they would hold the Taliban, the leaders of Afghanistan, personally responsible. So if there is going to be a retaliation, based on the evidence that they are now indicating to us here at NBC News, you can bet that that retaliation will most likely be against Afghanistan. Katie?
Andrea, of course, many people are asking the question, why now, why today? And I thought it was interesting when I read this afternoon that in June, a U.S. judge had set tomorrow as the sentencing date for a bin Laden associate for his role in the '98 bombing of that U.S. embassy in Tanzania that killed 213 people. The sentencing had been set for the federal courthouse near the World Trade Center, but the sentencing had been postponed some time ago without being rescheduled. Has anybody commented on the fact that the sentencing was scheduled for tomorrow?
Well, it is the sentencing. There are other facts. There is a case in Los Angeles right now involving a bin Laden associate who had been involved in allegedly masterminding one of the Millennium bombing plots that was foiled, and there have been intelligence successes. There was also a threat during that millennial period that bin Laden was involved in trying to organize attacks on 3 tourist locations in Jordan that are frequented by Americans of Yemen, all foiled around the time of the millennium. But as you well know, Katie, only 6 months later, they were able to, terrorists did ram the U.S.